The county assessor's office listed Elias Henderson's property as 112 acres of marginal agricultural land in the southwest corner of Hardin County, Indiana. Marginal. That was the word they used. It appeared in the same county ledger that recorded his property tax obligations every year. Obligations which Elias Henderson had never once failed to meet in 43 years of ownership, typed in the same bureaucratic font alongside notation of the crumbling barn, the aging outbuildings, and the farmhouse that had been built in 1911 and had not, in the assessor's professional opinion, been materially improved since sometime around the Eisenhower administration. Marginal. Elias had read that assessment once, back in 1971, when a young man from the county agricultural extension office had stopped by uninvited to discuss what he called consolidation opportunities, which was a polite way of saying that the big agribusiness operations spreading across the flat Indiana plains like a slow, well-capitalized flood were interested in absorbing what remained of the small family farms that had once defined every road, every crossroads, every fence line in this part of the state. The young man had sat at Elias's kitchen table, declined coffee, opened his briefcase, and proceeded to lay out a series of color-printed charts and projections that demonstrated, quite convincingly, that a 112-acre dairy operation with a milking herd of 31 cows was no longer economically viable in the modern agricultural landscape. Elias had listened to the whole presentation without saying a single word. He was 62 years old that autumn, a lean and weathered man with hands so scarred and thickened by decades of farm work that they looked like they'd been carved from the same hickory that braced his fence posts. His hair had gone fully white sometime in his 50s, cut short and neat the way the army had trained him to keep it, a habit that had never left him. His face was the kind of face that made strangers uncomfortable, not unfriendly, exactly, but composed in a way that suggested he was thinking about something much more important than whatever you were saying, and had been for most of his life. When the young extension man finished his presentation and waited expectantly for a response, Elias folded his hands on the kitchen table, looked out the window at the November gray pasture where his cows stood clustered near the fence line, and said, "You want some coffee?" The young man blinked. No, thank you. I was hoping we could discuss." "Drive safe going back," Elias said. And he stood up, which meant the meeting was over. The extension man gathered his charts and his briefcase and left. The cows stood in the pasture. The farm remained marginal, and Elias Henderson remained the kind of man that nobody in Hardin County really noticed until they needed something. He had been born in 1907 on this same land, the third son of a German immigrant father who had come to Indiana in 1890 with $14, a determination that frightened people, and a complete inability to explain any of it in English. His father had built the farmhouse with his own hands, quarrying limestone from the creek bank, hauling lumber from the mill in town with a team of percherons. He had planted the windbreak of Osage orange trees along the north fence line. Those same thorny, orange-bark trees that still stood in 1978, their trunks now 2 feet thick, their roots going down God only knew how deep, unimpressed by 70 years of Indiana weather. The old man had named the farm Henderson Creek Farm, which confused newcomers who expected a creek nearby and found none closer than 2 miles. Elias's father had explained once, in his accented English, that the creek was there in spirit, in the way that water always found its way to the right place if you were patient enough. Elias had grown up during the Depression, which meant he had grown up learning that nothing, not a bolt, not a belt, not a rusted tooth on a harrow, was ever thrown away if it could be repaired or repurposed. His father's shop, the old stone outbuilding behind the main barn, was a museum of iron patience. Coffee cans of sorted bolts organized by thread pitch, drawers of cotter pins and castle nuts, shelves of glass jars holding ball bearings recovered from discarded equipment, chains hanging in coils from hand-forged hooks. Everything that came to the Henderson farm stayed on the Henderson farm, because throwing something away was a sin against the future, and the future, his father had always said, was something a man could not afford to be careless about. He had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, December 8, 1941. He was 34 years old, older than most of the boys he served with, older than the lieutenants who commanded him in North Africa and Sicily and eventually on the grinding push-up through Italy. He had served in the motor pool, maintaining and repairing the armored half-tracks and jeeps and supply trucks that kept the Allied advance alive. He understood engines the way some men understood music, not just the theory of them, but the feel, the specific language of every knock and ping and hesitation that told a trained ear exactly where the problem lived and how to fix it. He had kept vehicles running with baling wire and salvaged parts in conditions that would have made a Detroit mechanic weep. He came home in 1945 to a farm that had been maintained, barely, by his mother and his older brother Thomas, who had a bad knee that had kept him out of the service. Thomas moved to Indianapolis 2 years later, married a woman who sold cosmetics, and never came back except at Christmas. Their mother died in 1952. Elias married Margaret Schell in 1946. And they built a life together on those 112 marginal acres with a patience and a steadiness that, from the outside, was easy to mistake for mere stubbornness. Margaret had died in the spring of 1974, a Tuesday morning in April when the redbuds were just coming out along the creek road, gone so suddenly from a stroke at the breakfast table that Elias had not even time to call for anyone. He had held her hand at the kitchen table for a long while afterward, looking out at those same redbuds through the window, before he finally went to the telephone. He did not speak about her death, not ever, not in the way that grief counselors or well-meaning neighbors wanted him to. He carried it the way he carried everything else, inward, silent, incorporated into the architecture of his daily life, like a load-bearing wall. After Margaret died, people in town began calling him Old Man Henderson, though most of them said it with a kind of affection that had respect buried somewhere inside it. The way you might say that old oak about a tree you'd been looking at your whole life without really thinking about cutting down. He was 67 in 1974, still working his herd alone, still baling his own hay in summer, still waking at 4 in the morning 7 days a week to begin the first milking. His son Robert lived in Columbus, Ohio, where he worked as an engineer for a company that made components for television sets. His daughter Carol was in Phoenix. They called on Sundays. They worried about him. He told them not to. The tractor had been on the farm since 1941. His father had purchased it that spring, the last major equipment purchase the old man had ever made. A 1939 International Harvester Farmall M, paint as red as fresh blood, chrome bright and squared in the industrial aesthetic of the late Depression years, when American manufacturers were only beginning to shake off the apologies and tentative designs of the lean decade and remember what serious iron looked like. The Farmall M was, by any objective measure, one of the finest general-purpose farm tractors ever built. Its four-cylinder engine displaced 248 cubic inches and ran on gasoline or distillate, producing somewhere around 33 horsepower at the drawbar, not impressive by modern standards, but delivered through a cast-iron drivetrain engineered with tolerances that left room for abuse, for neglect, for the accumulated sins of agricultural life, and still came back for more. What made the Farmall M remarkable, what would make it, on the 26th of January, 1978, the most important piece of equipment in Hardin County, Indiana, was what it did not have. It did not have a battery. It did not have an electric starter. It did not have an electronic ignition control unit, a glow plug controller, a fuel solenoid, a digital anything. What it had was a Fairbanks Morse magneto mounted on the right side of the engine, a precision device that generated its own spark by mechanical means, a spinning magnetic field inducing electrical current through coiled copper wire, timed by the mechanical rotation of the engine itself, dependent on nothing external, beholden to no battery, vulnerable to no cold-induced electrical failure, no corroded connector, no failed transistor. The magneto worked when the engine turned. The engine turned when the crankshaft moved. The crankshaft moved when a man put a steel crank handle into the notch at the front of the engine and swung his whole body into it. That was all. That was the complete system. By 1978, the tractor was 39 years old. It had outlasted the Korean War, outlasted Elias's father, outlasted his mother, outlasted his marriage, outlasted the post-war boom that had made neighbors buy shiny new equipment on credit and then sell their farms when the payments came due. The IH red had faded to a pink-orange that reminded people of old brick. The rear-wheel fenders were dented, and one of them was cracked through, held together with a steel strap and 4 bolts that Elias had welded on in 1963. The exhaust pipe had been replaced twice. The front cultivator mounts had been welded and re-welded so many times that the seams looked like scar tissue. The rubber on the rear tires had been recapped in 1969 at a cost that Elias had considered extravagant. But the engine was the engine. Iron bore walls that had been honed and re-honed until they still held compression within factory tolerance. Rod bearings replaced with the quiet competence of a man who knew what he was doing and saw no reason to make a production of it. A carburetor that Elias had rebuilt himself so many times he could have done it blindfolded. A valve train that he adjusted every spring and every fall, because his father had told him, valves are conversations, meaning that the engine told you what it needed if you listened to the sound of it running and made adjustments accordingly. Spark plugs changed every fall before the first hard freeze. Timing set by ear and feeler gauge in the stone shop, by the light of a trouble lamp hung from a nail. Usually on a Sunday afternoon when the chores were done and there was nothing else calling. He stored the tractor in the old stone outbuilding, the shop his father had built, because the stone walls kept the temperature 4 to 5 degrees warmer than outside, and because the shop had no drafts, and because a machine kept in a stone building in Indiana winter was a machine that would start in the morning. He kept 5 gallons of motor oil in a sealed metal can on the shelf beside the tractor, next to the hand crank, next to a trouble lamp, next to a coil of jumper cables he never used. The oil was 10W30, but in the winter months he kept one additional item alongside it, a cast iron pot, the same one Margaret had used for rendering lard, which now served a different purpose. In the cold months, when the temperature dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, Elias would take that pot to the farmhouse, fill it with fresh motor oil, set it on the wood stove burner, and let it heat until the oil was just warm, not hot enough to break down, just warm enough to pour like water instead of molasses. Then he'd carry the pot to the shop, drain the cold oil from the engine, and pour the warm oil in. A warm engine with warm oil, he had learned from his father and confirmed in 40 years of practical experience, was an engine that started. In the winter of 1977 going into 1978, nobody in Hardin County was paying much attention to Elias Henderson's maintenance habits. They had other things on their minds. It is difficult, in the age of the internet and 24-hour weather prediction, to convey how a blizzard arrived in rural Indiana in 1978. There was no Weather Channel. That wouldn't exist for another 4 years. There were local television weathermen who drew their fronts on magnetic boards with cartoon suns and drawn-on clouds. Cheerful men in plaid sport coats who got the 72-hour forecast right about half the time and the 48-hour forecast wrong often enough that farmers had long since learned to trust their joints and their barometers and the behavior of their cattle over the word of any television personality. The signs had been there for those who read them. The week before the storm, the barometric pressure had dropped with a steadiness that made old-timers nervous. The sky on the 24th had taken on that particular yellow-gray color, the color of old newspaper, that Elias associated with serious weather, not the fast-moving theatrical storms of summer, but the grinding, deliberate, committed storms of deep winter that moved slow and stayed long. His cows were restless at the evening milking on the 24th, pushing together in the barn with an anxiety that had nothing to do with feeding time and everything to do with what was in the air. One of his old heifers, a 12-year-old Guernsey he called simply the brown one, had spent the afternoon standing at the far corner of the pasture staring north, which she never did unless weather was coming. He spent the 25th preparing. He topped off the 5-gallon diesel tank for the farmhouse generator, a 1967 Onan unit bolted to a concrete pad behind the house, connected to the essential circuits, the well pump, the milking parlor, the chest freezer in the basement, the single electric space heater in the bedroom. He split a full cord of firewood that had been drying since fall and stacked it on the covered porch where it would stay dry. He filled every available container with water. The bathtub, the 3 5-gallon milk cans he kept washed and empty in the mudroom, every pot in the kitchen. He checked his kerosene supply for the 2 portable heaters he kept in the barn for the newborn calves. He confirmed his hay stores, enough for 3 weeks, which he judged, based on that yellow-gray sky, to be about right. He moved the Farmall M from the back corner of the shop to the front, where the doors were, so it could be driven out immediately if needed. He checked the oil, which was already fresh from his fall maintenance. He set the cast iron pot on the wood stove with 2 quarts of oil in it, just warming, so it would be ready. He inspected the tire chains, 2 sets, the heavy logging weight chains with cross-links the size of his thumb, which he'd bought secondhand from a county road crew in 1961 and had maintained every year since, straightening bent links with a hammer on the anvil, replacing cracked ones, rubbing the whole assembly with waste oil to prevent rust. He laid them out flat on the shop floor so they could be mounted in under 10 minutes. He did all of this without urgency, without drama, in the same methodical way he did everything on the farm, task by task, item by item, each action flowing from the previous one with the unhurried efficiency of long practice. He was not afraid of the coming storm. He had seen bad storms before. What he was ready. On the evening of January 25, 1978, the temperature in Hardin County was 18 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. The sky was absolutely still. The cows were already bedded down before dark, which they never did. Elias brought in an extra armload of wood, built up the fire in the wood stove until the cast iron top was too hot to touch, ate a bowl of soup standing at the kitchen counter looking out the window at the dark yard, and went to bed at 9 o'clock. The storm hit at 3 in the morning. He woke to the sound of it before he was fully conscious, a sound he had never heard in his life and would never fully be able to describe to anyone afterward. Not the howl of a winter wind, which he knew well, but something lower and more continuous, a sound like the world clearing its throat, a sound with weight and intention behind it. He lay in bed for exactly 3 seconds, which was his habit, 3 seconds to come fully awake and assess. Then he was on his feet, pulling on his Carhartt coveralls over his long underwear, his felt-lined POC boots, his work gloves, his wool-lined cap. The thermometer outside the kitchen window read 9 degrees below zero. The wind, when he cracked the back door to look out, hit him in the face like an open hand. Not cold so much as solid, a thing with physical presence, carrying with it a horizontal wall of snow so dense that his barn, 60 feet from the back door, was completely invisible. He had a rope. He had always kept a rope, ever since he was a boy and his father had showed him the old accounts of Dakota settlers found frozen 20 feet from their own doors in the 1888 blizzard, tied from the back door handle to the barn door, threaded through iron rings sunk into fence posts along the path. In a wideout, with no visibility and wind that could spin a man around and lose him in his own yard, that rope was the difference between making it and not making it. He had put it up every fall since 1948 and taken it down every spring. And there had been 3 winters in 40 years when he had actually needed it, when conditions were bad enough that without the rope, he would genuinely have been in trouble. This was going to be a 4th such winter. He fed and milked by feel and routine, the familiar geometry of the barn and anchor in the chaos of the storm. The cows were frightened, but their physical needs were the same as always. Hay, water, the mechanical comfort of being milked, and the familiar routine of it seemed to calm them the way it calmed him. The simple discipline of work as an antidote to the anxiety of forces beyond control. He finished the morning milking by 7, stored the milk in the cooling tank, and went back to the house. The radio, a Zenith console in the living room, built in 1958, repaired twice by Elias himself using a second-hand tube tester and a Radio Shack parts catalog, came to life with the county emergency broadcast. Schools closed. All non-essential travel prohibited by order of the governor. National Weather Service reporting wind chills of 50 to 60 degrees below zero. Drifting was already occurring on all rural routes. The county road commissioners were advising that primary state routes would be the only roads receiving attention, and that service to rural areas could not be guaranteed for a minimum of 48 hours. 48 hours. Elias looked out the window at the white wall where his barn should have been and thought, they're being optimistic. He set the cast iron pot on the wood stove, added the remaining quart of oil, and turned the burner to low. Then he sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and listened to the radio and waited, because waiting was sometimes the most disciplined thing you could do, and he had never been afraid of it. The Hardin County Sheriff's Department had acquired the snowcat in the fall of 1977, a decision that had generated a small controversy in the county commissioners' meeting and a somewhat larger controversy in the pages of the Kenton Ledger, the county weekly. $80,000 was a significant sum for a county of 18,000 people, and several commissioners had questioned whether a tracked snow rescue vehicle was truly necessary for a county that got, in an average year, approximately 31 inches of annual snowfall distributed across a mostly flat landscape, well served by county roads. The sheriff, a large and politically ambitious man named Dale Wrightsman, had made the case for the vehicle with reference to liability, emergency preparedness, and the general principle that modern times demanded modern equipment. He had also, though he did not say this in the public meeting, developed a strong personal attachment to the idea of a snowcat during a showing of the previous year's movie The White Dawn, in which a similar-looking vehicle had featured prominently and looked, in his opinion, extremely impressive. The vehicle was a Tucker Snowcat Model 1643, built in Oregon by the Tucker Manufacturing Company, a legitimate piece of serious equipment used in Antarctic expeditions and high-altitude mining operations. It rode on 4-tracked pontoons, wide rubber-tracked assemblies that distributed its considerable weight over a large surface area, allowing it to traverse deep snow that would swallow a conventional vehicle. It was powered by a Chrysler 318 cubic inch V8 engine running on diesel fuel. It was equipped with a sophisticated, for 1977, electronic ignition system, a diesel fuel preheater, and a cab capable of transporting up to 6 passengers in relative comfort. It was, in a temperate Midwestern winter, probably the most overspecified piece of emergency equipment the county could have purchased. It was also, as the technician from the dealer had mentioned in his delivery briefing, a detail that Sheriff Wrightsman had not retained, somewhat sensitive to extreme cold. The electronic ignition control module, a solid-state unit mounted on the firewall of the engine compartment, was rated for operation down to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The diesel fuel, even with anti-gel additive, could begin to wax, the paraffin crystals in the fuel precipitating out of solution and clogging the fine mesh fuel filter at temperatures below -15. These were not flaws, exactly. They were specifications. They assumed that a vehicle operated in conditions beyond those specifications would be preheated before use, kept in a heated storage facility, and maintained by technicians familiar with its specific requirements. The snowcat was stored in the equipment bay at the sheriff's department, which was, in theory, a heated building. In practice, the building's propane heating system had been running intermittently since November due to a faulty thermostat that was on the repair list but had not yet been addressed. On the night of January 25th, the bay temperature had dropped to approximately 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The snowcat had sat in 12-degree air for 6 hours before anyone thought to check on it. Indiana State Police Trooper Richard Calloway, 29 years old, 8 years on the force, had been assigned to operate the snowcat for the duration of the blizzard. He was not a bad man. He was young, and he was proud, and he believed, with the earnest sincerity of someone who has not yet been seriously wrong about anything important, in the power of good equipment and proper procedure. He had attended the Tucker dealer's 3-day training course in September. He had driven the snowcat 3 times in practice exercises, all in moderate conditions, all in temperatures above zero. He was, within those parameters, a competent operator. The call came in at 11:17 on the morning of January 26th. Sharon Kowalski, 23 years old, 8.5 months pregnant with her first child, had gone into labor at her home on County Road 140, 4 miles west of State Route 67. Her husband Dave had managed to get Sharon into their 1974 Chevrolet Impala and get 2 miles down the road before the car had buried itself in a drift that the county road grader hadn't reached yet. The drift was reported at over 6 feet. The Impala was in it to the doors. The temperature outside was -14 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills approaching -55. Sharon was in active labor. Dave had a CB radio. Virtually everyone in rural Indiana had gotten one in the CB craze of 1975 and 76, and for the first time this was not an affectation but a genuine lifeline, and had reached the county dispatcher through a relay chain involving 3 other CB operators before the radio traffic reached official channels. An ambulance from Kenton General had been dispatched immediately. It had made it approximately 3 miles before encountering the same drift conditions on State Route 67. Drifts that the county plows were not able to clear fast enough in the blowing snow to maintain an open road. The ambulance driver, a capable and experienced man named Gene Hutchins, had assessed the situation correctly and stayed put, keeping the engine running for heat, providing what comfort he could to the dispatcher via radio. He had a medical kit and some training. What he did not have was an obstetrician, a sterile delivery suite, or any particularly good options. Trooper Calloway arrived at the Sheriff's Department equipment bay at 11:45, suited up, and discovered that the snowcat would not start. He tried the electric starter 3 times. The engine turned over with a labored, slowing groan, the oil in the sump having thickened in the cold to approximately the consistency of library paste, but did not fire. He applied the diesel preheater, waited 5 minutes, tried again. Nothing. He checked the glow plugs. They showed voltage. He checked the fuel system. The fuel pump was operating. He tested the ignition system and found that the electronic control module was displaying a fault code, the code which, according to the Tucker service manual, indicated an internal temperature below operating threshold. The module was, in plain language, too cold to work. He called the dealer's service line. He was on hold for 11 minutes before reaching a technician, who told him that the module needed to be warmed to at least 40 degrees Fahrenheit before it would operate correctly, and that the recommended procedure was to remove it from the vehicle and warm it in a heated space for 30 to 45 minutes before reinstalling. The technician's tone was patient and helpful, and completely unaware that a woman was in labor in a 6-foot snow drift 4 miles away. Trooper Calloway, to his credit, did not panic. He began the removal procedure. He was not a trained mechanic, and the module was mounted in a location that required removal of a panel and a coolant hose bracket, and his hands, even in insulated gloves, were not working well in the cold of the equipment bay, and the metric fasteners, European threading, on an Oregon-built vehicle with a Detroit engine, because 1977 was a confusing time for American manufacturing, required a set of metric wrenches he had to locate in a toolbox. 41 minutes had passed since the call came in. The county dispatcher put out an all-units broadcast at 12:20. Snowcat unavailable due to mechanical issues. All available personnel to respond via whatever means accessible. Roads impassable by conventional vehicle on County Road 140 and State Route 67, west of county seat. Ambulance stationary at Route 67 and Township Road 16. Woman in active labor. Condition critical. The broadcast went out over the public safety frequencies, and, because someone at the dispatcher's console had also keyed the emergency broadcast tone, it went out over the county's AM radio relay, which meant that every radio in Hardin County that was turned on, and in a blizzard, every radio in Hardin County was turned on, received it, including the Zenith console in Elias Henderson's living room. He heard the broadcast through the static of the storm. He heard it once, and that was enough. He set his coffee cup on the counter. He looked out the window at the white wall. He calculated, not with pen and paper but in his head, with the spatial reasoning of a man who had been navigating this county in bad weather for 70 years, that his farm was approximately 1.5 miles from the ambulance's reported position on State Route 67. His lane ran north to the county road. The county road ran east 2 miles to State Route 67. The ambulance was south on 67 from that intersection by roughly 0.5 mile. A little over 3 miles total, if he kept to the roads. Less than 2.5 if he cut across the corner lot of the Millward farm. No crops in the field in January, and Harold Millward had been dead 4 years. The property sitting idle while his heirs argued about it in a Columbus law office, and came up on Route 67 from the ditch line. He went to the shop. The stone walls had held the temperature at 22 degrees, which was 14 degrees warmer than outside, and enough to have kept the engine oil at least partially fluid. He collected the cast iron pot from the wood stove on the way through, the oil in it warming now to perhaps 110 degrees. He could tell by how it moved when he carried it, fluid as water, fragrant with that particular mineral smell of warm motor oil that was as familiar to him as any smell in his life. He set the pot on the workbench. He pulled the drain plug from the tractor's oil pan. The old oil ran out thick and slow, like dark honey, into the drain pan on the floor, still fluid enough to drain, which meant the cold hadn't gotten to it the way it would have gotten to a machine stored outside. He let it drain for 2 minutes, then replaced the plug. He lifted the cast iron pot and poured the warm oil into the engine through the fill hole at the top, listening to it gurgle down through the passages, feeling the warmth of it on his wrist as he poured. He set the pot down and checked the level on the dipstick, full. He primed the carburetor. On the Farmall M, this meant opening the choke fully, then pulling the throttle to the fast idle position, then manually operating the primer lever on the carburetor 3 times to ensure the float bowl was full of fuel. He had done this so many times that his hands moved through the sequence without conscious direction, the muscle memory of decades moving through his body like water through a familiar channel. He took the hand crank from its hook on the wall. It was a piece of forged steel, S-curved, with a wooden handle worn smooth by the grip of his father's hands, and then his own. He inserted it into the crankshaft socket at the front of the engine, felt its seat with the familiar solid click of steel meeting steel. He set his feet. This was important. A man who kicked back on a hand crank if the engine backfired. A man who had his thumb wrapped around the crank instead of alongside it. A man whose feet were not solid and his body not braced. Such a man could break his wrist. He had seen it happen twice. Once on a neighbor's Minneapolis Moline in 1952 and once on his own tractor in 1963 when he was tired and careless. He had not broken his wrist either time, but he had learned to set his feet and keep his thumb on the correct side. He was 70 years old. His body, in January, with the cold in his joints and the arthritis in his left shoulder that had been with him since a half-track rollover in 1944 in the mud below Casino, was not the body of the 34-year-old motor pool mechanic who had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. It was a slower body, a stiffer body, a body that required a certain amount of warming up before it reached its full capability, much like the machine in front of him. He thought about Sharon Kowalski, whom he did not know personally, but whose father-in-law Frank Kowalski he had bought hay from on 2 occasions. He thought about what it was like to be 23 years old and in labor in a car buried in a snow drift in a blizzard with no way out. He thought about Margaret, who had delivered their son Robert in this same farmhouse in 1948 in a January ice storm when the roads were impassable and the doctor hadn't made it, and who had been, Margaret being Margaret, largely unimpressed by the inconvenience. He turned the crank. The engine did not fire on the first swing. Cold engines rarely did. He swung again, with the full arc of his body behind it, using his legs and his back instead of just his arms, because at 70 years old your arms could not do this alone. He felt the pistons move through their resistance, felt the compression pushing back against the crank at the top of each cylinder's stroke, felt the magneto, that spinning magnet generating its spark without any battery, without any module, without any solid-state component that could be too cold to function, delivering its voltage to the plugs. Third swing. A cough. A cloud of blue smoke from the exhaust pipe. He adjusted the choke, pulling it back 1/4, feeling the change in the mixture. Fourth swing. The engine caught on the exhaust stroke, ran for 2 seconds, died. He had been here before. He knew this moment. The moment between a cold engine almost willing to run and an engine that had committed to running, and he knew what it required. Patience and another swing. Fifth swing, full arc, every joint in his body registering its opinion. The engine fired. Not politely, not tentatively, but with the full-throated urgency of something that had been waiting and was now awake. The exhaust pipe roared. The tractor shook on its springs. The stone walls of the shop threw the sound back amplified, a thunder that Elias felt in his chest before he heard it with his ears. He pulled the choke back to the full open position, advanced the throttle to mid-range, and stood for 30 seconds listening to the engine find its rhythm. The idle smoothing from a rough, hunting stumble to a steady, confident beat, the cooling water beginning to circulate, the oil pressure building. He looked at the oil pressure gauge. 28 pounds. He did not move until it held there, steady, for a full minute. Then he went to the chain pile on the floor. Mounting chains on a tractor in -14 degrees Fahrenheit, in a stone building where the temperature was nevertheless 22 degrees, is a physical test that anyone who has done it remembers for the rest of their life. The chains were cold enough that the steel links could grip the skin through gloves if you touched them wrong. They weighed approximately 60 pounds per set, cross-linked logging chains, each cross-linked the width of 2 fingers, and they had to be laid out flat behind each rear tire. Then the tractor driven forward exactly far enough to position the tire in the center of the chain. Then the chains drawn up over the tire and connected at the top with the joining hooks, then tensioned by drawing the side chains tight with a chain binder. Elias had done this hundreds of times, many of them in conditions as bad or nearly as bad as these. He moved through the procedure with his habitual economy of motion, no wasted movement, no backtracking. The chains went on in 11 minutes. He tested each mounting hook, tugged each tension point, then drove the tractor back and forth the length of the shop twice to seat the chains fully before stopping to recheck the tension. The rear tires, with the chains mounted, looked like something from a war. The square lugs of the bar tires combined with the iron geometry of the chains made each wheel a weapon, a machine for gripping whatever surface it encountered and refusing to release it. In soft snow, the chains would pack and shed with each revolution. In hard-packed drift, they would cut and hold. The tractor weighed 5,400 pounds without ballast. With the chains adding weight to the rear axle and the engine producing its 33 horsepower at the drawbar in low gear, the Farmall M could pull, conservatively, between 4,000 and 5,000 pounds of deadweight resistance. A buried ambulance, a 1974 Ford E350 with a box body, weighed approximately 10,000 pounds loaded. But it was not dead weight. It was buried weight, which meant the snow was holding it, not the full gravity of it opposing his pull. If Gene Hutchins could get the wheels moving, if the ambulance could be dragged at an angle rather than straight back, if the approach was managed correctly, he would find out. He found his heaviest chain in the back of the shop, 50 feet of 3/8-inch grade 70 transport chain, rated to over 6,600 pounds working load limit, and coiled it onto the front of the tractor, hooking it over the drawbar bracket. He put his heavy face mask on over his cap, pulled his goggles down, the same skiing goggles he'd bought at the hardware store in 1971 and used every winter since, and opened the shop doors. The storm came in like a living thing. He drove the Farmall M out of the shop and into it. The noise was beyond description. The wind was running at what the Weather Service would later report as 55 miles per hour sustained, with gusts to 72, and it came from the northwest with nothing between Elias Henderson's farm and the Canadian border to slow it down except 500 miles of flat Indiana farmland. The snow it was carrying was not the heavy, wet snow of a milder storm. It was dry and crystalline, almost like fine sand in the way it moved, filling in every depression, building drifts against every obstacle with the patient indifference of a geological process. The farmyard was unrecognizable. The board fence along the lane had disappeared. The lane itself was visible only because the tree line on either side, those Osage orange trees his father had planted in 1890, was still standing, their orange bark trunks bending in the wind, their interlaced branches holding enough snow to mark the boundary of where the lane was. Even so, the drifts across the lane were 3 to 4 feet deep, packed hard by the wind, the kind of snow that a conventional vehicle's tires would climb over for 6 inches before spinning down through to the soft stuff beneath and sinking. The Farmall M's rear wheels, with the chains on, cut through it without slowing, not without effort. Elias could feel the resistance through the steering wheel and the seat. The tractor labored at each deep drift, the engine note dropping a half tone as the drawbar load increased, the chains biting and gripping and throwing arcs of packed snow to either side. He kept the throttle steady, not backing off and not goosing it, because on a tractor in deep snow the worst thing you could do was change throttle position abruptly. A sudden increase would spin the wheels, a sudden decrease would let the momentum die and allow the snow's resistance to stop you. Steady power, steady progress. He reached the county road in 12 minutes. The county road had been plowed at some point. He could tell by the geometry of the snow walls on either side, but the plowing had been hours ago and the wind had already rebuilt drifts across the road surface. Nothing the county road as a uniform lane, so much as a series of open pockets connected by passages through drifts. He turned east, towards State Route 67, keeping close to the north side where the ditch line gave him a reference. He could not see more than 15 feet in any direction. He navigated entirely by memory and the subtle feedback of the terrain. The way the tractor tilted slightly when the front wheels dropped into the ditch edge, the way the drifts formed predictably in the lee of the tree lines and fence rows he knew from 70 years of traveling this road. He had driven this road in bad weather before, but not weather quite like this, and he found himself grateful for the goggles, for the face mask, for the heavy canvas work jacket over the Carhartt coveralls, layers of insulation built up against a cold that wanted to be personal about the matter. At the Millward corner, he cut across the field rather than following the road, because the road would have taken him a quarter-mile east before turning south, and the field was flat and empty and would cut the distance by half. He had gambled correctly. The field's surface, without the funneling effect of road cuts and fence lines, had only moderate drifting, and the tractor moved across it steadily, the chains throwing a rooster tail of snow behind each rear wheel. He came out on State Route 67 through the ditch, a 4-foot drop that the tractor absorbed with a crash that rattled every bolt in his body, and turned south. He saw the ambulance's emergency lights before he saw the ambulance itself, the red and white strobes appearing out of the white wall as a diffuse pulse of color, like a heartbeat made visible. As he drew closer, the ambulance's shape emerged from the storm. A Ford E350 box body, county blue with reflective striping, sitting with its nose angled into the right-hand ditch, its rear end blocked by a drift that had built against it to door handle height. The engine was running. He could see the exhaust plume being torn sideways by the wind. The lights were on inside the cab. He pulled the tractor alongside the ambulance's passenger door and stopped. Gene Hutchins, the driver, opened the door and looked out at him with an expression that contained several complicated things simultaneously: relief, disbelief, a question he hadn't fully formed yet, and the professional composure of a man who had made a career of staying calm in bad situations. "Henderson," Hutchins shouted over the wind. Elias nodded. He pointed to the front of the ambulance and held up the chain. Hutchins understood immediately. "Can you pull her straight back? I'll try to steer her out." Elias shook his head. He pointed to the south, then made a hooking gesture. "Pull at an angle, toward the open lane." Yeah, that's better," Hutchins said. "Give me 30 seconds to warn the patient." He disappeared back into the ambulance. Elias climbed down from the tractor, every joint in his body registering its protest as he dropped to the snow-covered road surface, and walked to the front of the ambulance. He found the tow hook on the frame, a standard 2-inch receiver hook, mounted where the factory brush guard met the front crossmember. He uncoiled the 50-foot chain from the tractor's front bracket and hooked it through. He walked the chain back to the tractor, measuring the pull angle in his head. He needed to draw the ambulance slightly left, to the south lane of the road, before dragging it back, because the snow that had built against its right side was acting as a wall and would resist a straight rear pull. If he pulled at a 20-degree angle to the left and rear simultaneously, using the tractor's momentum to break the packed snow's grip before hauling back, he could work the ambulance out of the drift like a cork from a bottle. He had gotten a stuck vehicle out of a ditch 20 feet from this exact spot in 1965, a neighbor's grain truck, using the same tractor. He had a pretty good idea of what the job required. He mounted the tractor, settled himself in the seat, engaged the PTO brake to make sure there was no load on the secondary drives, and put the transmission in low range, the lowest gear on the Farmall M, designed for applications requiring maximum torque at minimum speed. Heavy tillage in clay soil, pulling tree stumps, extracting buried vehicles from 6-foot snow drifts in the worst blizzard Indiana had seen in a century. He took the slack out of the chain slowly, feeling it come tight through the tractor's frame, feeling the resistance build. He could feel the ambulance behind him as a presence, a weight, a conversation he was having through steel and chain. He gave it more throttle. Steady increase, not a lurch. The engine note dropped. The rear wheels bit. The chains threw snow in 2 high arcs. The tractor moved, 3 inches, 4 inches, 5, and behind it, reluctantly, with a sound he could feel through the chain more than hear over the wind, the ambulance began to move. It broke free of the drift in one long, slow, continuous motion, not a sudden release but a gradual surrender, the packed snow giving way on one side first, and then the other, and the ambulance swinging slightly left as it came, exactly as he had planned, rotating to face the open lane. He pulled it 40 feet down the road to where the surface was clear enough for the ambulance's own tires to find purchase. He stopped, got down, disconnected the chain, walked to Gene Hutchins's window. "You good?" he said. Hutchins looked at him with those same complicated eyes. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, we're good." "Geez," he paused. From the back of the ambulance came a sound that had nothing to do with the storm, a high and urgent sound that was as old as human beings and as new as that particular moment. "She's doing fine. We gotta go." "Go," Elias said. The ambulance pulled onto the cleared lane and accelerated south toward Kenton General, its lights strobing in the white wall, diminishing, vanishing into the storm. Elias stood in the road for a moment. The wind tried to knock him over. He leaned into it, and let it try. Then he turned the tractor north, toward home. He found out later that the snowcat had eventually been started after Trooper Calloway had warmed the electronic ignition module in the heated brake room of the sheriff's department, reinstalled it, and successfully gotten the vehicle operational at approximately 1:45 in the afternoon, approximately 2 hours and 25 minutes after the initial call. By that time, Sharon Kowalski had been at Kenton General for nearly an hour, attended by an obstetrician and a full nursing staff, warm and safe, and in the process of delivering a healthy 7-pound 4-ounce boy whom she and her husband Dave would name Michael. The snowcat operated effectively for the remainder of the blizzard and performed several genuine rescues over the following 2 days, as the storm continued and the roads remained impassable. Elias bore it no particular ill will. It was a good machine for the conditions it could handle. The conditions of January 26, 1978, had simply not been among them. The storm itself lasted another 36 hours, dropping a total of approximately 20 inches of snow across Hardin County and building drifts reported at up to 25 feet in exposed locations along the highway cuts. The National Guard deployed on the 27th. The governor declared a state of emergency. 31 people died across Indiana in the blizzard and its immediate aftermath, most of them from exposure or carbon monoxide poisoning from running vehicles buried in drifts. Elias lost 2 calves and one of the older cows, losses he absorbed with his characteristic lack of visible reaction, entering them in his farm record book in the same neat penciled hand he used for everything. January 1978 storm. Lost Guernsey heifer, 11 years, and 2 Holstein calves. Feed adequate. Equipment performed. Gene Hutchins told the story at the county fair that summer, in the informal gathering behind the 4-H building where the farm equipment men always congregated on Friday evening with cans of beer from the cooler in someone's truck bed. He told it simply and accurately, the way a man who had been there told a thing. What happened, in what order, what the old man had done, and how he had done it. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. The story traveled the way stories in small Indiana counties travel, slowly, accurately, with each retelling adding small details, but not changing the essential shape of it. By August it had reached the hardware store in Kenton, the co-op elevator on Route 67, the back table at Dorothy's Diner where the retired farmers ate breakfast on weekday mornings and conducted the county's real business, while the commissioner's office remained officially closed. At each of these places the story was received with a particular kind of quiet satisfaction, not triumph. Exactly, not schadenfreude, but something more considered, the satisfaction of men who had spent their lives being called marginal, being told their methods were outdated, their equipment obsolete, their knowledge irrelevant to the modern agricultural economy, and had always suspected, on some level, that the moment of reckoning would come in a form nobody had anticipated. Sheriff Reitzman sent Elias a formal letter of commendation in February, on county stationery with the sheriff's department letterhead. Elias read it once, set it on the kitchen table, and the next time anyone looked it was under one leg of the table to level a wobble that had been bothering him since 1974. Whether this was a statement or just a practical solution to a practical problem was a question that nobody who knew him well bothered to ask. He did not seek attention. He did not call the newspaper. He did not appear on the local evening news, though a young reporter from the Kenton Ledger drove out to the farm in March, when the roads were clear, and asked if he'd be willing to talk about the rescue. Elias had looked at her for a moment. She was young, maybe 25, with a notebook and a press credential on a lanyard. Tractor started, he said. Pulled the ambulance out. Baby was born fine. That's, yes, but, you want some coffee? She did, it turned out. She sat at the kitchen table for an hour, and Elias did eventually talk, though not about the rescue in the way she had expected. He talked about his father building the farmhouse. He talked about the Osage orange trees along the north fence line. He talked about the magneto on the Farmall M, how it worked, why a thing that made its own spark without depending on any external source was a different kind of reliable than a thing that depended on a battery and a module and a supply chain and a service manual. He talked about warm oil in a cold engine and what it meant to understand what the things you depended on actually needed, rather than just assuming they would work because they were expensive. The reporter wrote a piece that ran on the front page below the fold. It was a good piece. She had listened carefully and reproduced the conversation faithfully. Elias read it once and said, to no one in particular, that she'd gotten it right. By March the drifts were receding. First along the south-facing slopes where the sun got to them, then across the fields in a general withdrawal, the snow pulling back from the high ground first and leaving the low spots last, the way defeat always moves, from the edges inward. The fence lines emerged from their white burial, posts tilted by the weight of the drifted snow, one section of board fence along the east pasture blown completely flat that needed to be reset. The Farmall M had pulled every post hole digger and fence post driver through 3 seasons since 1965, and it would pull them again in April, once the ground thawed enough to work. Elias serviced the tractor on the first Saturday of March that was warm enough to work in the shop without his breath clouding in front of him. He drained the oil that had been in the engine since January, dark with use, bearing the gray particulate of combustion, and replaced it with fresh. He checked the magneto timing, which was within specification. He pulled the spark plugs and examined the firing ends. The color told him the mixture was right, the porcelain clean and white gray, no black fouling, no oil deposits. He adjusted the tappet clearance, checking each valve with the feeler gauge and correcting the intake on cylinder 3, which was 1/1000th of an inch too tight. He re-gapped the plugs, not because they needed it, but because the process itself was a form of attention, the kind of attention that prevented future problems by discovering present ones before they became serious. He replaced the single plug that showed the beginning of electrode erosion. He greased every fitting, checked every belt, adjusted the fan belt tension by pressing it at the midpoint and feeling for the specified half-inch of deflection. He hung the hand crank back on its hook. He stood for a moment in the shop, looking at the tractor in the afternoon light that came through the small window in the south wall, the light catching the faded IH red of the hood and making it look, for a moment, almost as vivid as the day his father had driven it home from the dealer in 1941, the old man so pleased with himself that he'd driven it around the yard twice before putting it in the shop, which was the only time Elias had ever seen his father do anything for no practical reason at all. He thought about his father, who had come to this country with $14 and an inability to explain himself in English, and had built something out of flat ground and patient work that was still here, still running, still capable of matters of life and death when the moment required it. He thought about Michael Kowalski, who was 3 months old now, living in a farmhouse on County Road 140 with parents who would never fully be able to explain to him, not in any way he would understand until he was much older, the specific sequence of events that had attended his arrival in the world. The cast-iron pot on the wood stove, warm with oil, the stone shop and its 4-degree advantage over the outside air, the hand crank and the magneto and the spark that required nothing from the grid, nothing from the supply chain, nothing from any electronic module rated to some threshold below which it politely refused to function. Simple things, properly maintained. That was all it was. He turned off the trouble lamp. He pulled the shop door closed. He walked back to the farmhouse through the mud of the March thaw, the same mud his father had walked through and his father's father before that, mud that came and went every year with the reliability of the season itself. And he went inside and put the kettle on for coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon light and was, as far as anyone looking through the window could have told, simply an old man sitting in a kitchen, unremarkable, unnoticed, exactly as ordinary as a piece of flat ground before someone with patience and a plan decides what to do with it. The 1939 Farmall M is still on the Henderson property, or was the last time anyone checked the county records. Elias Henderson passed away in 1986, in his 79th year, in the same farmhouse his father had built from quarried limestone in 1911. He died on a Tuesday morning in April, which would have struck him as a coincidence worth noting if he had been the type to note such things. His son Robert came down from Columbus and found everything in order. The bills were paid. The equipment was maintained and covered. The farm record book, a green ledger of the type that can still occasionally be found in farm auctions, recorded every year of operation from 1941 to the fall of 1985 in Elias's precise penciled hand. Milk production by cow, by month, by year. Equipment repairs and the parts used. Hay yields, weather events, losses. The last entry, dated October 14, 1985, read, Fall service complete. Oil changed, plugs checked, timing verified. Machine ready. He had not written which machine. He didn't need to. In the Henderson lexicon, there was only one machine that merited that much confidence in its readiness, that much attention to its preparation, that complete a record of its service life. The farm was sold to a neighbor's son in 1987, and the new owner, a sensible young man who had grown up around old iron, kept the Farmall in the same stone shop and used it for the same purposes, pulling fence posts, clearing heavy snow from the lane, the occasional extraction of stuck vehicles from the drainage ditch along the county road. He serviced it every fall, as Elias had, checking the timing and the valves and the magneto and the plugs and hanging the hand crank back on its hook when he was done. He kept the cast iron pot on the shelf beside it. He wasn't sure why it was there, not at first. He found out from Gene Hutchins, who was still driving ambulance in 1988 and who told him the story one afternoon at Dorothy's diner without being asked, in the way that certain stories attach themselves to certain places and come out when the time is right. The young man listened to the whole thing without saying much, the way you listen to something that confirmed something you already half knew. When Hutchins finished, the young man nodded and looked out the window at the flat winter fields. "Makes sense," he said. That was the Henderson County's verdict on the whole affair. It makes sense. The old machine, maintained and ready. The warm oil in the cold morning. The hand crank turning when nothing else would. A man who knew what things needed and gave it to them without being asked, without fanfare, without an audience, against a cold that stopped everything that depended on circuits and modules and the comforting assumption that modern meant reliable. It makes sense. In 1978, in the worst blizzard the state had seen in a generation, when an $80,000 machine sat frozen in an equipment bay and the roads were impassable and a young woman needed to reach a hospital and the temperature outside was trying its honest best to make everything stop, it was the one thing still moving that made sense. A piece of iron and magnet and spark, built when the men who designed it did not yet know how to make things complicated, pulling a path through the white. That's all. That was enough. The Great Blizzard of 1978 killed 70 people across the Midwest and remains one of the most severe winter storms in Indiana and Ohio history. Wind chills reached -55 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. The Tucker Snowcat, despite its issues that day, is genuinely among the most capable tracked vehicles ever built for snow travel. The International Harvester Farmall M, produced from 1939 to 1952, used a magneto ignition system and manual hand crank starting, making it operable in cold conditions that would disable any battery-dependent equipment. Hundreds of Farmall M tractors remain in working condition today, some of them original to their first owners' farms. The magneto still spins. The spark still fires. The engine, if you've taken care of it, still starts.